The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the second of our ongoing Zazen Kai. Every couple of weeks, right now during the coronavirus event, we are doing Zoom Zazen Kai, and we welcome everyone here. Thank you for coming. So this one is May 16th, and I'd like to share and comment on a message that came to me from one of our California folks. It's a very important message. Let's read it here. Oops, upside down. I was talking with a friend, and he said, if everything is perfect, whole, and complete, why is there extreme suffering in the universe? He brought up some of the worst stories, what humans can do, and I'm not going to repeat them. Thank you. I appreciate that he didn't repeat them, because here's something to notice, and this is important with regard to our vigilance with news reports and Facebook and so on. The more we put negative stuff or challenging stuff or painful stuff or horrible stuff in our minds by reading about them, thinking about them, so on and so forth, the more it is going to skew our minds toward the negative and quite possibly bring on depression. It's very important right now during this extreme situation with the coronavirus pandemic to really titrate your access to news and to things like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and so on, because it does have an effect. What we put into our brains, what comes into our senses, registers and reinforces. The more it's put in, the more we pay attention, for example, to the negative news stories or tune into the fear, the more that registers in our brain and affects our whole being. So it's especially important nowadays to really be careful about that and to balance it out by coming up with some positive news, or going out into nature, or doing some relaxing. Maybe do some cooking or something. Here's your chance, with everything so shut down, to be able to do some things you weren't able to do because there wasn't enough time, because you were so busy otherwise. And yet these things can be really nourishing, refreshing, and grounding, helpful. Here's your chance. Take advantage of it. To continue, I didn't really have a good answer. I thought of the chant, within darkness there's light, but do not look for the light. Within light there's darkness, but do not look for the darkness. I also thought of a talk I heard by Thich Nhat Hanh when he said, I would not want to be in a world where there is no suffering. And lastly, I thought of the story of Job in the Bible, where the standard interpretation of the story is that God had good reasons for suffering, but Job shouldn't be expected to know what they are. I believe the causes for suffering are not able to be known by the thinking mind, but are there, and there are reasons, just as there are reasons why Saturn orbits our sun as it does. Also, as the Buddha said, the world of form, life and death, has within it a certain amount of suffering. While this type of contemplation satisfies my mind, it doesn't help someone when their family member is fallen by some tragedy. So I'm asking you, if you have any wisdom you could share on the topic of why suffering is part of the human condition. Thank you. This was the biggest question the Buddha had too. As you know, he was seriously protected, actually cocooned when he was growing up, protected from any possible negative experience. And that must have been quite a job, because anybody who was sick had to be whisked away, so that he didn't have a chance to experience what somebody else being sick was like. And if somebody died back then, people didn't live anywhere near as long as they do now, not even half as long as they do now. So it would be assumed that perhaps somebody in his family or in his general environment might have died, but apparently not, because finally he got really, really curious about what life was like outside of his enclosed environment. And he snuck out. And as you know, the first night he saw someone who was bent over with age, hardly any hair left on their head, obviously having a difficult time walking around. And he was shocked. He'd never seen anybody like that. And he asked the person that was with him, what's that? And they said, well, that's somebody who's old. That's going to happen to you too, you know. I mean, if you live long enough. And he was shocked. So he went out again the next night. And the next night he saw someone who was ill. And it reminds me of the time when I was in Hong Kong many years ago and rounded a corner, and right there in the middle of the street was an old woman throwing up. She squatted down and she was throwing up. It's not the sight you normally see in America. You also don't see people squatting along the roadside to poop or pee either, but you do see that in other countries, as we did. And for the Buddha, however, and it's hard to know what exactly was going on with this person who was ill, whether he had leprosy and so he was missing his nose, and or whether he had sores all over his body, who knows. But at any rate, the upshot of it was that it shocked the Buddha once more. And then he again said, what's going on here? He said, well, that's somebody who's sick, and it's likely to happen to you too if you live long enough. And so he went out another night, and this time he saw a corpse, which in certain parts of the world is very easy to see on the side of the road. And in fact, the last few hours that we were in Bodh Gaya in 1996, first of all, before we got to Bodh Gaya, actually, we were delayed, which is not uncommon in India. I had to go all the way across from Delhi, all the way, 24-hour train trip. And things happened, as they do in India. And so we were 2 days late getting to this conference that we were going to, a first ever conference of ordained women Buddhists in Bodh Gaya. And as it turns out, had we arrived when we were originally planning to arrive, we might have fallen into the situation that 2 Westerners did fall into, in which they were murdered. So that started out an interesting note for that almost month-long conference that we were on. Right away, death in our face. And then it ramped up too, because one of the women that was supposed to come to that conference, I think she was a French woman, who was riding in a rickshaw in Delhi. That rickshaw was was hit by a dump truck, and she was mortally wounded, serious brain damage from which she would never recover. And the Indian medical establishment took advantage of that to explore her brain and do some surgery, which of course didn't do any good, but it may have educated some new Indian doctors. And she lasted for 2 weeks. In the meantime, those women at the conference who had known her personally took turns going back to Delhi to be in the hospital with her, to take care of her in the hospital. One of the things about many Asian hospitals, particularly back then, and particularly places like India or, for example, Burma, where we lived, it is the family that takes care of the patient when they're in the hospital. It's not necessarily the hospital or the nurses. The nurses have specialized duties, but in terms of feeding and otherwise taking care of a patient in a hospital, it's the family's responsibility. So then about a little bit more than halfway into the conference, she died. Then the night before we left to go to Delhi at the end of the conference, I got a fax saying my father was dying. And the next day, we had hired a taxi to take us to Gaya, which is where the train was. And there was a tremendous storm that happened. The Burmese Sahara in Bodh Gaya was 2 feet deep in fallen branches. And that was the case throughout the trip. It's only like a half-hour trip. It's pouring rain. And as we continued along, there, alongside the road, was a corpse. So this shocked the Buddha, of course. And again, well, this is going to happen to you too, eventually, is what he was told. He went out one more night, and this time he saw someone who was committed deeply to spiritual practice. And he was awed by the sense of peace, of ease that this person expressed without any words. And so he thought, oh, maybe there's a way out of this suffering. If this person isn't suffering in this moment, and yet all these other things I've seen have been sources of suffering, then maybe there's hope. At which point he left his environment and went into the forest to do the spiritual practice of the day, which was ascetic practices. And they're still pretty common in India these days. Ascetic practices involve basically mortifying your body in various different creative ways. When John Handlin was in India on a pilgrimage, he came across a man who had been standing, I think, for 20 years, bent over with his head in a hole. That was his spiritual practice. There are the people that lie on beds of nails. Those are pretty famous in India. And there are other ways to challenge your body. And the Buddha did that. Or I should say the Buddha to be, Siddhartha Gautama, did do that. It was said finally at the end of 6 years, when he decided that he better quit that practice or he was going to die before he had his answers of why is there suffering in the world? Isn't there some release? because it was said that he was living on 1 grain of rice a day, which is hardly enough to sustain a human being, despite the stories of the Catholic nun quite a long time ago who apparently sustained herself on one wafer a day, 1 communion wafer a day. We don't know what else was going on there or how accurate the reporting was. But at any rate, this was a big question, just like it is for Genshin's friend. And at some level for all of us, unless we've managed to stuff it away underneath a lot of toys and entertainment, which is way too easy to do these days. And that is why, in a certain way, the coronavirus can be a blessing, because it's in our face. And there are too many unknowns to assume anything about it. And so we're off balance unless we have tuned into our innate sense of balance, which is possible. When we move through life-centered, these kinds of things we pay attention to, of course, but they don't have the opportunity to, as I would say, wrap us around the tree. Yes, they're felt. The pain, the suffering is felt, but it is not the kind of pain and suffering that takes place when we haven't seen a different way. We haven't recognized the sources of suffering. So what are the sources of suffering? We're born. Right there, we're liable for challenges in life. We're liable for old age, sickness, and there's not a question about it, we are going to die. And we're liable to have situations where there are people that we love and care about that disappear, either death or rejection or who knows what. And there are also situations where there are people that we are around that we would rather not be around. It's uncomfortable. We feel challenged by those people in whatever ways, or uncomfortable. They're picking on us or something, who knows? It doesn't really matter. But there are other things. If we're born into a country as affluent as America, and we're born on the affluent side, still we experience those things. If we're born in America or some other country where we're not on the affluent side, then there is suffering from not having enough to eat, not having enough money to survive, not having a job that we like, and being the wrong color of our skin. There are a lot of things, excuse me, that can cause suffering, and it's legitimate suffering. But let me remind you of Jacques Lusseran in Buchenwald. Blind and starving, and in an environment where there was terror constantly, a constant threat of death from you didn't know where. You could be marched out and shot with a band playing. You could be sent to the so-called showers where you were gassed. You could be stabbed in the middle of the night by some sadistic guard, or you could be throttled by one of your fellow inmates who just lost it. There was a tremendous amount of suffering in that camp. And finally, after 5 months of enduring it, he got sick. It's known, especially these days, it's known that stress hampers our immune system. When the cortisol is running constantly through our body, it interferes with the ability for our immune system to be online, and we're so much more readily sick as a result. And that most likely is what happened to him. At any rate, he was so sick, they carried him away to die. That was the one gift that the fellow inmates gave each other, was to carry someone in their midst who was dying away to what they euphemistically called the hospital, which was simply just a piece of concrete out on the ground. By then it was warm, so he wasn't going to be suffering any more than with the illness that he was already suffering from. And what did he do? We know about this because he did survive. He tuned in. And this is a fundamental aspect of doing deep practice, is to tune in. To tune into our body, to feel the energy in our body. In traditional Japanese Zen, we're taught to override it, basically. And nobody says that specific. Well, actually, they do say that specifically. Just the mu, or just the breath, or other admonitions intended for us to stuff it, which unfortunately doesn't really help. We may be able to stuff it, but it's not gone. Whatever it was that we stuffed, whatever uncomfortableness, whatever trauma, whatever difficult experience, doesn't go away when we stuff it. It lurks in the corners of our mind, ready to pounce at any time. And this is why people trained in the traditional way in the Western culture, and for that matter, some of the Japanese so-called masters who have come to the States and proclaimed themselves as teachers, it results in the dysfunctional behavior patterns still being there. They're not gotten rid of. The only way to work with that is to go into our body. And if the situation is strong enough, intense enough, then to work with a therapist. It may seem like we are abandoning our practice when we tune in, but we're not. One of the major practices in Buddhism is awareness of breath. Another one is awareness of sound. In each of these practices, we're tuning in as completely as possible without ignoring anything else, without shoving anything else away, to the experience of breathing or the experience of hearing. We're so tuned in that we can allow other things to let go, which is very different from suppressing them. And to do this in an ongoing manner is to move in a very effective way, such that even if suffering is there, it is not impactive. It's very difficult to express this accurately, but when we are so tuned in to the moment as it appears to be, without resistance, without trying to make it different, there is space. And when we tune into difficult feelings, difficult memories, such things, again, it has to be a tuning in beyond thoughts. And thoughts can go blah, 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 blah. like the clouds in the sky. And still behind the clouds, there is that clear sky. Behind the thoughts, there is that clear mind. The thoughts don't make the cloud, or I should say that the clouds don't make the sky any less clear. They appear to be, but the sky is still clear there, behind them, above them, beyond them. And the same way with the thoughts. And the less energy we put into the thoughts, including not trying to battle them, as I said a little while ago, the more effective it is in bringing ourselves into such presence that there is no problem. That even if there is a challenging situation, it's not a problem. This is really, really vital. A monk a long time ago, centuries ago, asked Master Joshu, does even a dog have the Buddha nature? Back then, and still, it may even be common now, but certainly back then and in recent history, dogs were considered pretty negative, wretched creatures in China. In fact, they were eaten. And so this monk was really flummoxed. He had this idea that our true nature is something incredible, beautiful, wonderful, and something like a dog, which was despicable, couldn't possibly have it. And yet some part of him was kind of wondering about that anyway, because he'd been told that all beings have the Buddha nature. All beings are this essence, this life essence. And so he asked his teacher, does even the dog have the Buddha nature? And Joshu answered mu, which means no or not, negative. And yet at the same time, a different time, a monk asked the same teacher, does a dog have the Buddha nature? And he said wu, which means yes, affirmative. So how can something have the Buddha nature and not have the Buddha nature? How can something be with a capital B and not be at the same time? And that, of course, is one of the fundamental breakthrough koans, the koan mu. What is this mu? This true nature, this life essence that we're told if we realize it, if we recognize it, it can make us free of suffering. It's not quite that quick, as most of you already know. We do our practice reaching beyond our thoughts, our ideas, our assumptions, our conditioning, over and over and over again, in reaching beyond through the breath, through the koan, through the awareness of breath, through the awareness of sound, going beyond, letting go the present moment, ideas, assumptions, letting go conditioning. And as we do that, something rather wonderful happens. If we do it on a regular basis and continue doing it, where we have been caught begins to let go. We begin to see where we're misunderstanding things, or where things aren't quite the way we assumed they would be, where we develop some ideas about stuff that may not be accurate, that our experiences may have caused us to draw conclusions that aren't correct. And in that way, we gradually become able to comprehend space in our life where there isn't suffering, even in the midst of suffering, which is a real conundrum, but it is true. And each person has the ability to do this. It's challenging to practice because we're bumping up against all these places where we keep ourselves trapped. We have so many ideas about what practice is, about what life is, about who we are. It goes on and on and on. And we keep ourselves so tied up in knots, straitjacketed really, with those assumptions that no wonder there's suffering. But we can become free. This practice has endured for more than 2,500 years, and it wouldn't have if it didn't work. And in Rinzai Zen, the practice is foremost. We need to experience the transformation, not look at it, not think about it, not write about it, not hear about it, but experience it. And of course, there is something that Torii Enji, who is an incredible Zen master, a student of Hakuin, Dharma successor of Hakuin, who spoke of the long maturation, which is a vital aspect of practice. Because we can have a Kensho experience, a little Satori experience, even a big Satori experience, but it may temporarily open our mind to a more clear and let go view. But those habit patterns come rolling back in and have to be dealt with. They're considerably weaker for what we have realized, but they still have to be dealt with because otherwise we're running on automatic. And automatic is a wonderful way to stay suffering. Growing up, as I said, we develop ideas about ourselves. We have a self-image that is nothing but a story. It's an accumulation of conditioning. It's an accumulation of assumptions about ourselves as a result of things that happen to us. And so we are invested in that. Often, if we've had trauma, we're deeply invested in it because it is so frightening not to be who we think we are. And children want desperately to belong. Children want desperately to be loved, to be cared for. And even as painful as it is when rejections take place, if our parents or one parent or another is rejecting, then we try to bury it. We try to pretend we're okay anyway, but somewhere lurking in the back of our minds, there is this assumption that we're not good enough. That if we were good enough, these things wouldn't happen to us. But it's not even necessarily that conscious. There's just this difficult, painful feeling that we try to override time and again, try to shove away time and again, that we don't make it, that we're not good enough, that we're not successful enough, we're not lovable enough. And it's pretty strong. The cultural anthropologists have stated that there's an assumption that it's actually genetically based. In ancient times, people couldn't live all by themselves because they simply, the way of making food for yourself wasn't such that you could. You couldn't bring down a mastodon. You couldn't beat off a saber-toothed tiger alone. It's conceivable that maybe somehow remotely somebody might have been able to do that, but in general, no. It takes a group of people. And even in the contemporary hunter-gatherer society, there are groups of people that go out to get game. Even in northern New Mexico, if someone has gotten there's you have to submit a request to have a permit to kill an animal during hunting season, and if you get it, then you and your friends go out in a hunting party, and you get this animal if you're fortunate, I guess, is what you would call it. And then the meat is shared by everybody who was in the hunting party. And that's kind of the way it is in the current hunter-gatherer society. And we don't need to get into anything about hunting. I did meet on an airplane once a man who, when he was 3, his older sister got scarlet fever, I think it was. And in those days, as it was when I was a child, if somebody got a communicable disease like that, scarlet fever, chickenpox, measles, mumps, then you were quarantined. And a sign was put in your front window of your house saying quarantine, and people knew not to come. That was an effort to keep that disease from spreading. Nowadays, of course, you can get vaccinations, and most of them are not a problem. This is a challenge for people nowadays with the coronavirus, because that's the same way we are trying to deal with this unknown illness that is causing a great deal of devastation in human life, is by quarantining, by limiting our access to anywhere where we would be exposed to it. It's the old-fashioned way, when there's no medicine that could take care of the condition. So life is suffering, but we don't have to suffer. There is suffering, and there is suffering caused by suffering. For example, if we have broken a leg, then that accident is painful, usually. Maybe not initially, but certainly shortly afterwards, when the body gets over the shock of it. And there's challenges too, knitting that bone together. And if we get sick also, but it's kind of interesting. Sickness does not have to result in suffering. Breaking bones doesn't have to result in suffering. Suffering is what we do with it here. Our thoughts about it, our assumptions about it, our attempts to avoid it, even when it's happened. Yes, there is the pain of losing somebody, particularly losing somebody from a devastating accident or illness, or even losing somebody who's just gotten old and is dying. It's the end of their life. It's even more painful to lose a child. Here in the village, there was a case some years back where the child somehow managed, unbeknownst to the parents, to slide off the edge of the bed next to the wall and suffocate. This was an infant. Things happen. There's SIDS, sudden death syndrome, and various other ways that there can be suffering. And we feel it. We cry. We feel the pain in our heart. We feel the pain in our body. We feel the regret that someone we loved isn't there anymore. There's a lot of that. But we don't have to keep it going. And we don't have to make it into ongoing suffering. When we are so one with the pain, there's nobody suffering. And that is quite true. The secret, of course, is to own it. The secret is to feel it without trying to push it away. Of course, we do try to push it away. And we go into denial and we go back into recognition that this has happened, and then back into denial and back into recognition that it has happened and the pain that comes from that. But over time, it changes. And life moves on. And we can become free. Right within pain and suffering, there is a seed of freedom from suffering. And this is something that we can't just say. We have to realize if we're to be truly free. And that realization only comes after ongoing effort at tuning in, at not pushing away, at exploring, at reaching beyond the known, beyond our assumptions, open to possibility. In that way, we can truly become free. It's important to recognize that as you do your practice, there's a part of you that really is invested in the status quo, however painful it is, that doesn't want to lose the self-image, because if we aren't who we think we are, oh my God, are we going to disappear? Are we going to know how to behave in society? Well, there's a deeper level of understanding. And science has begun to realize that there's a left brain and right brain cognitive situation where the left brain in general, not exclusively, but in general, is the brain that is, or the hemisphere that is responsible for thoughts, for language, for speaking, I should say, speaking and writing and reading. And yet the right brain still can comprehend. And it isn't dependent on thinking. And so it offers some way of functioning in the world that is quite effective. And here I call back a friend of mine, Mario, who I met when I was living at Sogenji. He was a friend of the Roshis, Swiss-Italian, or Italian-Swiss, I never know which it's supposed to be. And he was stabbed in the heart many, many years before that. It was about 10 years, actually, prior to that accident, or prior that I met him. So 10 years after the accident. And he, was it 10 years? Anyway, at any rate, he found himself awake in the hospital 6 weeks later. The doctors told him he had been clinically dead for 6 to 8 minutes, which was long enough to do some residual damage. He woke up unable to see anything. He was totally blind. He could not move. He was completely paralyzed. And he couldn't speak, of course, because he was paralyzed, but he could hear. And he could comprehend, not through thinking, because he said that when he was able finally to return to being able to think, it was an enormous disappointment to him, because suddenly he wasn't, there's something between him and being. He was able to function. He actually was able to get to a point where he healed. When I met him, he was walking, talking, and the only thing that was residual was that he had something that is known as Parkinsonism, where you have what appear to be some of the symptoms of Parkinson's, but it's not actually Parkinson's. It was residual nerve damage. And at one point, while we were out and about, there was an incident where he simply dropped to the ground as if somebody pulled the plug. Obviously, he was used to that. So were the two people with him, one of whom was his longtime girlfriend, who's still with him these days, many years later, because that was in the early 90s when I met him. And he was still able to function without having to think. So this fear that can come up for people, that if we're not who we think we are, and it's not that conscious, there's just some fear that comes up normally when we get close to letting it go, is the fear of disappearing, a fear of not being able to function without that thinking brain. But consider this. Small children don't think until their brain has developed to a certain point. They don't talk until they're close to 2 years old. They may babble at a certain point. Even small infants don't babble. And yet they function. They're able to eat, sleep, poop, and pee, eventually to sit up, eventually to stand up and walk, without having to think and to learn things. So be aware of that. But yes, there is suffering in the world. And it offers a way out. And it's not something that we need to be caught in. And not needing to be caught in doesn't mean avoidance. It means when difficult, painful things happen, we walk right in and embrace the experience in our bodies. Sometime back, I shared with you a recommendation that you get hold of and read a book by Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, called In Love with the World, a monk's journey through the bardos of living and dying. He had chosen to test his practice, deepen his practice, by leaving his monastery, of which he was in charge. He set things in place so that his students would not be abandoned. It took him 1.5 years to do the planning and effect it. And then he snuck out one night because he didn't want anybody to know that he was leaving until after the fact, because they wouldn't let him go. And he wandered as a homeless person in India for the next 4 or 5 years. He almost died from food poisoning. And he wrote that he actually got sick a number of times after that as well. It's rather easy to get sick in India. And yet the book is amazing because it is both an expression of the things he had to deal with and his way of dealing with them as a deeply respected, long-time Buddhist teacher. I still urge you to to get it, a copy and read it if you have a chance, because it is inspiring. He met all kinds of difficulties, and it bumped right up against his conditioning and his life experience and his fears. And yet he was able to walk right in and come out free. And so can you. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows. If I can find how to turn off the recording. Oops, that's not it. Okay.